There is an argument to be made that if we try to slow down the transition and if we try to protect the interests of the fossil fuel companies, a lot of them state-owned in Poland, then we run a risk that the innovators that will benefit from this creative destruction will not be from Poland, or like they're not going to benefit the Polish economy to an extent that they could.
Welcome to the Warsaw Wire, the podcast about Poland's economy, business, and energy transition. I'm Alicja Ptak, your host and Deputy Editor-in-Chief at Notes from Poland. Today, we are talking about what Poland can learn from the most recent economic prize awarded by the Swedish Central Bank, often called the Nobel in Economics, especially when it comes to energy transition. The 2024 and 2025 Nobel winners studied how long-term growth actually happens through innovation, creative destruction, and institutions that either help new technologies scale or quietly block them. In this episode, we are looking at what those ideas can mean for Poland in very practical terms. My guest is Paweł Wiejski, energy and climate expert, whose recent article for the Green Energy Institute applies these Nobel insights directly to the Poland's energy transition. Paweł, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start, can you tell us a little bit about what are those main ideas that were behind the works of the researchers that were recently awarded by this economic Nobel?
So for the last 2 years, the economists that won the so-called economic Nobel Prize focused, as you said in the introduction, about how does growth happen and why some countries experience it and others don't. What led me to study them and try to think about how it applies to climate and energy policy, which are my specialty. It is because in the debating climate and energy transition, we very often focus on the cost and benefit analysis, which makes sense, right? How much is it going to cost if our energy system is going to be based on renewables? How much is it going to cost if our energy system is going to be based on fossil fuels? But this debate can be a little bit reductive in a sense that it doesn't take into account this debate about long-term growth. Where does it come from? And so the 2024 Economics Nobel Prize winners focused in their work a lot about institutions. So that's Acemoglu and Robinson, and they wrote a very, very famous book called Why Nations Fail, where they argued that the reason some countries are rich or like experience growth is not because they have natural resources or not because of some, let's say, factors that are kind of natural or coming from their geography. Because countries that experience economic growth are very different from each other. And sometimes, for example, countries that are resource rich, for example, many African countries experience this, go into something that is called resource trap, where they have a lot of natural resources, which could be like a pathway to growth for them, but they don't. They stay poor, and that is because, as Acemoglu and Robinson argued, their institutions are extractive. They take the resources and use them to enrich the elites, or in case of many post-colonial countries, in the past, the institutions were extracting resources and for the benefit of the colonizers. They argue that countries with open institutions, with institutions that allow for change when something goes wrong, allow for people to participate in them, and allow for the growth or the wealth to be shared, those are the countries that experience success. And this is very pertinent, and I think it's a very good way to think about economic growth, and definitely is useful in terms of economic transition, or like economic transition, but also energy transition. It doesn't necessarily matter if we have very good conditions for energy transition, whether we have plenty of renewables, or, for example, great conditions for hydro energy, or we have an experienced or expansive nuclear program. If we don't have institutions that allow for sharing the benefits of new energy sources or sharing the burden of new investments equitably, then we are not going to do well in energy transition. So that was the 2024 Nobel Prize. And that's the part of my article that I entitled, that was about institutions. And the other Nobel Prize winners from last year, they focus more on innovation. So the role of innovation and creative destruction in the economic development. The idea is that the economic development is not a linear process, but it's more of a kind of a cycle where there is an existing monopolist who takes benefits from the status quo, and along comes an innovator that changes things and basically deprives the former monopolist of the economic benefits. So the way to think about it is basically that technological development is kind of a revolution that repeats itself. And the way that we can apply it to energy transition is pretty self-explanatory. I mean, we are experiencing a dynamic growth of some technologies that threaten the status quo. So in Poland, that status quo and the industry that benefits from the current situation is the fossil fuel industry, which is being threatened by the growing expanse of renewables, which are significantly cheaper and are growing at a much faster rate than fossil fuels ever were. But this is threatening the interests of powerful groups, like, for example, the coal industry in Poland. So their reaction is to try to stop that development from happening. And it is pretty clear that this is what was happening in Poland for a very long time. Now it has been changing quite dramatically. We have seen a very dynamic development of renewables in Poland for the last 10 years, especially.
Speaking of that creative destruction in Poland and in coal, do you think if there is some critical mass that has been changing recently? Because yes, we have seen a great and stubborn opposition of the coal industry regarding the introduction of renewables in Poland and generally shutting down mines. There were protests. But recently, last month, actually, the president signed a bill that allows some mines, state mines, to shut down and provides compensation for workers. So I am wondering, are we seeing this critical moment right now in Poland where the creative destruction that was mentioned in the works of recent Nobel laureates becoming possible finally? What do you think?
Definitely, and it's not something that started yesterday. On the level of rhetorics, I think this is the biggest change that is happening. That it used to be 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it was an absolute mainstream idea that we are going to stick with coal for as long as possible, and this has changed dramatically, to the point where even people from coal companies admit openly that the time of coal is coming to an end. And the question isn't whether we stick with coal or we go for renewables, but rather how fast and in what way, like what kind of compensation we give for the people who work in the coal industry, and how do we manage the transition. So definitely the creative destruction is happening, but the kind of context for why this is important and why is it important for to think about the innovator and the kind of the theory that when you innovate because you want to benefit from the innovation. There is an argument to be made that if we try to slow down the transition and if we try to protect the interests of the, fossil fuel companies, for example, a lot of them state-owned in Poland, then we run a risk that the innovators that will benefit from this creative destruction will not be from Poland, or like they're not going to benefit the Polish economy to an extent that they could. I'm talking about basically making sure that Polish companies are in those value chains of green technologies, of renewables, batteries, of hydrogen, CCS, and all other technologies that are important for the energy transition.
But there is at the same time parts of society, parts of political scene that are saying that this kind of investment right now is making us uncompetitive at this moment because it requires a lot of investments, first of all, in the grid, in new capacities, and at the same time, we are as the most coal-heavy economy in Europe, being penalized heavily by ETS costs, etc. What would you tell to those people, and what the works of the Nobel winners are telling us about this kind of conundrum, if we can call it like that?
Daron Acemoglu wrote an article that I quote in the article in my article about how innovations are sticky. So basically, innovations, once there is innovations in a certain field, then innovations in the same field follow. He gives an example of shale gas in the US. So shale gas revolution in the US made the US an biggest exporter of energy in the world, and actually led to lower emissions because coal in the US was replaced by gas, which has lower emissions. But at the same time, the rate of investment in clean renewable technologies fell in the US because all the attention was on the gas industry, and the money for innovations in the renewables just wasn't there. There was no interest from the investors. And this is one of the reasons why the US is losing with China in the field of innovations in green technologies like solar panels, batteries. And this is something that can very much happen in Poland. So if we try to focus on the industries that are kind of doomed to go extinct, then we're going to lose against our competitors. But this is not only a Polish problem. We can see this with the whole EU. The reason why recently there has been a reversal in the ban for sales of new internal combustion engines vehicles in the EU, that was mostly because of the enormous pressure of mostly German automotive industry that wanted to stick to the processes that they knew and wanted to keep investing in the processes, in the value chains of basically diesel and gasoline cars. And this is something that has very real policy effects, and it's not going to lead actually to them succeeding in this area. It's just going to allow them to kind of stick to the status quo and not allow any new companies to enter the market. And it is going to eventually fail. Those companies that will enter the market will be Chinese, American, and not European.
Let's talk a little bit about the human side of the creative destruction. And this is something that we are seeing in Poland right now, the debate about this at least. Because every time that an industry is being distracted by this innovator, there are also people left behind who are working in these industries. What kind of solutions Poland does have for those people who will be left from the transition, from the shutting down of the mines?
I think it goes beyond the mines, honestly, Because the thing with the mining industry is the amount of people who work in the mining industry has been reducing in recent decades by itself. So it is a kind of a gradual process, which is good. And there is not really a risk of a shock that we experienced, for example, in the 90s, where a lot of industries shut down and a lot of people ended up without work. It doesn't mean that the problem doesn't exist, especially locally in some regions. The reliance on a mine or a coal plant can be quite big, especially when you take into account the fact that those people have families and the mines also use other companies like services from other companies. So they can, of course, have an important role in the local economy. There are local just transition plans in most coal regions, unfortunately not all of them. Those have been mandated by the EU. There hasn't really been an honest attempt to plan the just transition from the government's perspective. There is the social contract that the previous government signed with the mining industry, with the hard coal mining industry. But for example, it doesn't take into account the lignite mines, which also have a lot of people working there and benefit their communities. So there is definitely a need to some kind of an agreement, a dialogue between the coal mining industry and the coal regions and the government that is more open than the process has been in recent years. And it doesn't only concern mining. There's also a lot of other industries that are facing an existential danger because of the innovation process. And for this, one instrument that could help could be the, as I said, industrial policy. So a strategy that encompasses all industries and kind of tries to answer the question, how are they going to change and what is the role of the state to make sure that they, first of all, remain competitive and that also the social aspect is taken into account. So if an industry is going to disappear because, for example, a lot of Polish companies are in the value chains of automotive industry as it is now, and there is a very real question, what is going to happen when the automotive industry, as it does, is going to transition away from gasoline and diesel cars into electric vehicles? Then the value chains look very differently. So there is a lot to think about and a lot of ways in which the state can actually benefit this process by providing a space for open dialogue, but also providing targeted subsidies and financing for innovation to happen in Poland and not in other countries.
Part of their works of Aghion and Howitt focuses on protecting people and not institutions. And given everything that you just said, do you think that Poland is doing a good job in introducing the ideas put forward by these researchers? Or should we do something else or more?
Not really. I don't think that. I think it's pretty clear that the interests, especially of state-owned companies, very often prevail over the kind of environment where innovators can thrive, and at the same time, people are protected. I think there is like two elements that are missing. One of them is actually treating industry seriously, and that's something that doesn't just happen by itself, but also needs it needs the state to provide services. For example, there are some technologies to decarbonize industry that are going to also require investment from the state. For example, in infrastructure, some industries are not going to decarbonize without either CCS, or capturing the CO2 that they produce, or without hydrogen. For both of those, we need physical infrastructure that the companies themselves are probably not going to be able to just build out of their own pockets. And this is something that we have to figure out from this government level. We have to look into where can we store CO2? How can we make sure that it is a safe process and the CO2 is actually stored and doesn't escape? How do we transport the CO2? How do we connect with other European countries who face the same problem? And this is something that we are not doing right now at all. And definitely it has a very real impact on allowing innovations to happen. Because if the innovators know that, okay, there's no infrastructure, there is no plan, there's no idea what is going to happen, that they're not going to think about solutions here in Poland. They're going to kind of wait and see for the future, maybe if Poland actually will want to invest in those things. So this is one thing. In terms of the social protection, it goes hand in hand. Also, of course, there is going to be a big role of the private sector in this transition, and it is already happening. The investments are already happening, but definitely we can also look what is the potential in specific regions for new industries to develop and give them support, to give them tax breaks or easier access to investment sites. Also cooperation with education institutions, so like universities. There are many things that the state can do and is not currently doing.
In Poland, we have a fantastic example of this creative destruction happening, and a creative destruction that targeted, in a way, a public state company. And I'm talking about InPost, which created a chain of parcel locker deliveries that became so popular that not only we have about 10,000 of parcel lockers across the country, but it was also implemented in other countries by InPost itself, but also by other companies, as I've seen recently, for example, in Denmark. And the company that was distracted by this was Polish Post, which hasn't recovered, but to be honest, it was never really doing very great. And it seems to me that the state is so struggling how to approach the business strategy of Polish Post, which can't compete anymore. I don't know. Have you thought about these examples, or when you were writing your article and looking at the ideas brought forward by the Nobel winners?
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert on postal services, but I do remember when this is maybe a good example that when InPost was threatening the monopoly of the Polish Post, there was at least at some point a regulation introduced which did not allow light letters to be transferred by any other company except for the Post. So there was a weight limit, and in order to beat that weight limit, I think it was InPost that they added a weights to their letters. You would put a weight to an envelope to make it heavier, to make it beat the regulations. So there was kind of a reaction of the incumbent and kind of pressure on the government to do something with the emerging competition. And this is something that is happening, but I'm not necessarily. I think there is also some of the state companies in Poland, for example, are not only just free market companies, like market agents, and that should be left alone. And if they fail, that's fine. They also provide services. And I think that the public service argument is to be taken into account. And it is, when we look at companies, for example, like the, transmission system operators and the electricity grid, so PSE, they actually are going to suffer from creative destruction caused by development of renewables. And the reason why is because less and less electricity is going to, or smaller and smaller proportion of electricity is going to be going through the transmission grid. The reason why is because the electricity that is being produced now is more decentralized and is going to be more localized. So a lot of smaller, let's say, Well, an easy example to think about it is an individual home that has solar panels. If you have solar panels, then you're going to take less energy from the grid. And that means that the amount of electricity that we use is going to be far greater than the amount that actually goes through the big high voltage lines. It didn't used to be that way. When you have a bunch of huge coal plants, then basically the whole electricity that gets produced goes through those big power lines and then ends up in people's homes. And when the system is more complicated, more decentralized, then the role of the operator changes. And I think actually the Polish energy, the grids, so PSE, recognizes this in their new strategy, that their role is going to change, that they no longer can operate as they used to, and they have to take on different roles and provide different services as a kind of a public service provider, and not only as a company that operates on the free market, because they cannot fail. Like, they still guarantee that the system works. And this is kind of a thinking that we could probably apply to some other sectors where also, the heating companies also provide essential public service, like district heating. And they also cannot be allowed to fail, and their role also has to evolve as the technology changes, and there's innovators that kind of try to replace them.
Let's talk a little bit about institutions. The researchers say that innovation happening or innovation stalling often relies on the quality of the institutions in different countries. And we've seen in recent years some problems with the institutions that worked perfectly to support the energy transition. And I'm speaking about programs such as the Clean Air program or even my electricity program that created a boom in solar panel on the micro installation level. And that was my first instinct, that Poland had great ideas, great institutional ideas that helped to boost on the individual level some movement towards the clean transition. But something happened in both of those programs that stalled this progress.
I think those are great examples, because they are indeed successful programs that worked at some point and then stopped. And there is, of course, both of them have their own history and their own design flaws that made it happen, like that caused them to fail eventually. But the thing that unites them and like that they share is that they were ad hoc programs that were not a result of strategic thinking and planning, where we are, where do we want to get, but rather an ad hoc program that had a lot of political momentum behind it, but at the same time did not have the full awareness of how it's going to impact the rest of the system. In terms of the program to Mój Prąd, so the one to subsidize solar panels, it led to an explosion of popularity of prosumerism and of a lot of solar panels popping up on the roofs of homes, which is a good thing. But at the same time, the government was still pretending that it's not going to have an impact on the coal electricity generation, and it's not going to have an impact on the electricity system. And this was a mistake, and it had to be slowed down. Like, the rate of the installation of solar panels had to be slowed down, because the system would not be able to handle it, and it would be too costly. And with the Clean Air program, there wasn't a clear idea how quickly we want to make sure that all of the homes in Poland no longer use coal as their heating source because it's terrible for the air quality. It was just a kind of a quick fix that we see there is a problem. We have really bad air, but we don't have, for example, an indicator. Where do we want to be in 30 years? Where do we want to be in 20 years? Where do we want to be in 10? And that led to the fact that the program did not have, for example, secure financing for the whole period that it's going to work. It was kind of financed ad hoc from EU funds and sometimes from tough discussions between the Ministry of Climate and the Ministry of Finance. If there was a strategy, if there was a kind of a strategic thinking, then we could plan those things out. And also we could allow for the institutions to learn from their mistakes. This is also something that this, for example, Joel Mokyr, I quote one of his articles where he speaks of institutions in a bit of a broader sense, not only as state institutions, but also as kind of institutions, as informal institutions as well. So that the development is not only the economic growth doesn't only come from good public institutions, but also from a society forming its institutions. So the private sector, the non-governmental organizations kind of working in together to achieve a certain goal and encourage innovations, for example. This is something that is missing, and the kind of individualistic approach can be very hurtful to the success of economic success of a state. But it is difficult to achieve, of course. But the state can try to encourage it by being more open. For example, the changes to the clean air program have not been well communicated or well consulted. They were done in a very haphazard way. And this is something that I think is one of the reasons why the program is now struggling.
And I wonder, will there be some long-term impact on the trust of the public in these and other institutions aiming at accelerating the energy transition in Poland? Because from talking to regular people who are not very much interested in the energy transition and energy, ins and outs of the energy system, they tell me that yes, like 10 years ago or so, when my electricity program was starting out, it was clear to people that it is a great idea to have solar panels on your roof because you could decrease your bills substantially. But later, after the way prosumers settle with the energy companies changed, meaning that it wasn't clear anymore if the investment that they made, even after subsidies, will pan out for them. And right now they are telling me, okay, but why should I invest in this? And the other thing is the clean air program, which left many investors, companies, and households in a limbo where they don't know if they will get their money back. So from my perspective, those two programs shattered trust of regular people in transformation. And is this an example of how Poland failed in keeping institutions that would support the energy transition? Or is it just something that we can move past and concentrate on something else?
Absolutely. I think the trust that you mentioned is extremely important and is going to be very difficult to rebuild. I don't know if it is salvageable within those programs. Perhaps it would be a good idea to start something new that would be based on the strategic thinking and that would be planned in a way that the changes could be predictable and the people would not be surprised that, oh, okay, so now the money just ran out, so it's not going to be possible to access it anymore. Or, okay, my neighbor got those preferential conditions that are not tenable for everyone, and now I cannot get the same treatment. this is something that lacks very much from the debate on the energy transition. And it is not only those two programs. I think this is also about the financing for the innovations for the companies. This is the kind of stability and the clear idea where we are going with our energy transition is important for businesses, and it can be a decision between, locating a factory in Poland, for example, of batteries, of some elements of the electric vehicle value system, value chain, and locating it elsewhere where it might be, for example, more expensive, but there is more stability that actually the conditions will not change drastically, for example, when the new government shows up.
And what are the then key takeaways right now, key ideas that Poland should still introduce that are becoming apparent from the works of those researchers that we talked about today?
Okay, so first thing that matters is it's not only about the cost economic benefit in this moment, it is also about institution building and building institutions that can learn from their mistakes, that are open to input from all stakeholders. And it might be costly at the beginning. It is more costly to build a good institution than it is to build a bad institution, but it is worth it. And the second thing is that innovation matters, and it is very much connected to strategic thinking. Where do we need to support it? What needs to happen? It's not only about subsidies, but also about enabling conditions for the cooperation between universities and companies, building infrastructure that is needed for the innovations to happen, and also not protecting the incumbent at any cost and forcing them to adapt as well if they don't want to be replaced.
Before we wrap up, if you are interested in how Poland got here in the first place, we previously discussed the 2024 Nobel and Poland's growth story with the economist Marcin Piątkowski. That episode looks more at the past, while this conversation today was really about the present and the future. But I leave you the link to the show in the show notes and embed it for those watching on YouTube. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please comment, like, and subscribe. And Paweł, thank you very much. It was very interesting. Thank you for talking to us.
Thanks so much.
Original